Coming up.
Is there a financial risk to the retirement savings of individual Canadians if the government attempts to meet environmental targets through pension and investment funds?
That particular risk is huge.
How many billions of dollars would you potentially expect the Canadian pension plan, the most important safety net for Canadians, to potentially lose in the coming years?
If I have one piece of advice for this committee, it is to avoid a great deal of economic and financial sacrifice for no apparent gain.
The most important thing we can do is to have consumers stop consuming fossil fuels.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Floor is yours.
And thank you for the witnesses that are coming out this afternoon. Mr. Keeley, my questions will be for you this afternoon. Can a government meet their environmental targets by regulating the financial system or mandating climate risk disclosures?
I think, as I said in my opening remarks, that for us to achieve a net zero world, we're going to have individuals, public policies, a wide range of other forms of taxes, and to create the world that we want to see. Businesses are in an ancillary position; they're not in a leading position. So to actually say that we can regulate business and finance to a greener world is, I think, misguided.
The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions has introduced mandatory climate-related financial disclosure expectations for financial institutions in Canada. What are the risks associated with climate-related disclosures or ESG scores?
Well, any good financier will tell you that having more information is better and more disclosures is better, but it's a question of how that information would be utilized. To the extent, the best example would be that Scope 1, Scope 2, and ideally Scope 3 emissions would be required to be reported. But what would be done with that information is particularly dangerous. To the extent that we are going to result in a situation where we're merely divesting from brown companies, divesting from brown buildings, starving them of capital, will have exactly the wrong answer to our climate problems. We actually need to invest in those industries, not divest.
Is there a financial risk to the retirement savings of individual Canadians if the government attempts to meet environmental targets through pension and investment funds?
That particular risk is huge, daunting, and would almost certainly result in the loss of hundreds of billions of dollars of income over many years to Canadian pensioners. We need to invest in the world that will be, not some imagined world. As we all know, the ESG strategies that have been, there's $45 trillion in ESG strategies. It's not that these strategies are underfunded, dear friends. It's that they simply don't work. And they have been underperforming markets by 250 basis points for the last 5 years. That's going to result, if we continue in that path, underfunded pensions, people that cannot support themselves in their old age.
I forgot to actually expand on the divestment part of this. Will divestment achieve environmental objectives, and should Canadians be concerned with this approach?
I think everyone should be concerned, not just Canadians. I think there was a recent episode with ExxonMobil where we all saw that they were, a number of investors voted, they remain shareholders and put in new board members. Right now, ExxonMobil is one of the leading investors in carbon capture. Thank God investors stayed engaged with ExxonMobil to help move them in the right direction. Divestiture is almost certainly the exact opposite of what we require right now to create the world that we want.
And how do you turn that tide? What else can you advise this committee as far as, because that is a common theme in this talk, is get out of the, and it'll just basically, the businesses will die. Is there anything else we can think about divestment and actually maybe something else we should consider there?
I think that debate is now raging on college campuses across the United States. As we all know, everybody's calling for the divestiture of Amazon, the divestiture of companies that they think will somehow end fighting in Gaza. We have to understand how limited divestiture is as a tool for solving our problems. Divestiture is not the way to go if you're actually trying to influence a corporation's behavior or affect an economic outcome.
You've stated, and I quote, committing to net zero portfolio target today is somewhat like agreeing to a gluten-free diet before knowing which foods contain gluten or what nutrients one might be sacrificing in the process, end quote. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Well, Thank you for reading my book. At least somebody has. It's very clear that we don't know what this divestiture movements will actually create. That $45 trillion that I spoke about is largely based upon divestiture. And many, many individuals have adopted these ESG indices that MSCI and others are coming out with. And they're basically signing up for investing in less than 1/2 of the investable market. Of the 500 corporations in the S&P 500, only 230 are currently fully aligned with net zero 2050. Why would anybody decide that they're only going to invest in those companies when in fact it is the browner ones that have the chance to become better corporations and outperform over time?
If pension and investment funds adopt net zero portfolios, would this do anything to achieve a net zero world?
Clearly not. A green portfolio does not create a green world. If it did, we would have gotten rid of smoking, gambling, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. All of these have been divested from over decades, and yet you can still grab a pack of cigarettes and have a beer. Divestiture has not worked to solve the underlying problems.
Bill Gates has said, and I quote, ESG investing so far has probably not removed 1 ton of carbon out of the air. Do you agree with this statement? And if so, what are the implications of allocating trillions of dollars in capital to ESG portfolios that do not reduce a quantifiable amount of emissions?
I think Bill Gates just summarized, as we have been discussing, the limited efficacy of divestiture as a tool for changing the world and changing industry. That's what Bill Gates was referring to in that quote. I obviously agree with him. I quoted him in my book.
Thank you. Mr. Keeley, with the remaining time I have available, I have a question for you, and it starts with a quote. The quote is, "We have a grave responsibility to ensure that children not be denied their future. The climate run amok is crying out to all of us to halt this illusion of omnipotence. We need a turning point, demonstrating a clear and tangible political will that can lead to a decisive acceleration of ecological transition." Do you know who said that?
I do not know who said it, but I do not, I think disclosure is a good thing. I think that was directed towards me. Disclosures are a good thing, that they're not equated with divestment. I wanted to make that point.
I'm glad to hear that, and thank you. The person who quoted that was the Pope. It seems as though in your opening statement, you characterized some of the Pope's positioning as not as a climate activist. He actually is quite a climate activist.
Very much so. He's very much so. And he endorsed my book, by the way, on the cover.
Fabulous. Congratulations.
Unfortunately,
sir, I have one last question.
Go ahead, very quickly.
Mr. Keeley, do you feel like emissions ought to be measured per capita, per person, or by flag?
I don't know what good any of those would do, but I think that we all should be examining our carbon footprints individually, if that's the question.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's also, to me, telling that the Conservative leader has refused to say whether he would scrap the industrial carbon price. And my question is to Ms. Brannan-Jepp. The federal backstop when it comes to the industrial carbon price is one of the most critical policies that we have. Industrial carbon pricing does the bulk of our emissions reduction. The Pathways Alliance new head has actually called on the Conservative leader to state his position on the industrial carbon price and whether he would keep. It's wild to me that when we're in a position where oil and gas leaders are more climate friendly than a leader of a political party in Canada. That's wild. But I'm curious from your perspective of creating certainty, what does that kind of uncertainty do?
I think Canada should increase overall net zero funding and do more to de-risk and address barriers to private sector investment. We hear from our members all the time that they very much appreciate partnerships with government and private sector funders to enhance and innovate, find bleeding edge solutions to our greatest climate challenges. And so I think this is really where...
And particularly on the industrial carbon pricing question, is greater certainty better for...
Yeah, 15 seconds, please, on that, yeah.
If I may jump in very quickly, one thing that we've been advocating on very consistently is that certainty and predictability. I think we've seen a number of projects put on hold for a number of different reasons, and I think one of the main reasons for many is that lack of certainty and predictability.
Mr. Keeley, in your opening statements, you mentioned that ESG investment strategies have broadly underperformed more diversified strategies by a specific number of 250 basis points per annum over the the past 5 years. So I'm curious, in terms of real dollar values, what does that actually look like? And if there were to be a Liberal NDP bloc-imposed ESG mandate, how many billions of dollars would you potentially expect the Canadian pension plan, the most important safety net for Canadians, to potentially lose in the coming years?
So the Canadian pension plan, if I understand, is worth right now about $650 billion Canadian. You can just take 2.5% of that per year and subtract it from what it would otherwise be if you continue in the ESG strategies. That, of course, amounts to tens of billions of dollars, really in less than a decade. So it's quite a meaningful sum of money.
Thank you. And globally speaking, are there examples of other nations that have tried to achieve environmental targets via financial systems, and what has the results of those been?
Thankfully, no. There has been a renewed focus on fiduciary rules. I was asking one of my Canadian friends whether or not Canada has the same fiduciary rule as they have in the United States. Fiduciary rules, largely speaking, preclude the investment strategies that are suboptimal, that is to say, achieve poor risk-adjusted returns. I think that I'm not exactly sure of what the Canadian equivalent is of a fiduciary rule, but if you have one, it solves a lot of your problems.
Thank you. And you mentioned in your opening remarks that energy security is part of national security, and obviously we've had many nations come to Canada looking for clean Canadian liquefied natural gas, to which our government has decided that there is no business case because we've made it so difficult for projects to move forward. In your view, would imposing an ESG mandate on financial institutions or pension funds make it even more difficult for Canadian energy projects to access funding potentially?
It almost certainly would be counterproductive in the extreme. That is to say, what you want to do to create a greener world, which I do want to create a greener world, you need to turn brown companies green, and you actually need to stop consuming fossil fuels, and you need to switch to a much cleaner energy mix. In Canada's case, that would be more nuclear. Climate change is a huge challenge, but to describe it as an existential threat is an excellent example, and I won't use the word hysterical, of gross exaggeration that actually clouds clear thinking on the matter.
No, thank you. And recognize that Canada has some of the most stringent environmental and labor regulations in the world. I'm a believer that we should be exporting our bounty of natural resources around the world rather than have it being produced in countries like, as you mentioned, Russia or China or India or Iran or Venezuela. Is it preferable, in your view, that we produce more in this country versus the countries I just listed or others around the world?
I applaud every member of this committee and all Canadians who are trying to do their part in creating a greener world. I just, as I tried to state in my opening remarks, feel that it's fairly logical and we should continue to expect that temperatures are going higher. So when it comes to prioritizing public assets and public expenditures, the approach of adaptation will be far better spent than mitigation.
In your view, how should we rank the importance of measuring outcomes and results of our policies? And in your view, would a ESG mandate aid the improvement of environmental outcome results in any way?
Very briefly, please. You have 10 seconds.
Yeah. Do I have time or no?
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Basically a yes or no.
The answer is no.
Thank you. Mr. Cram for 4 minutes.
I support carbon tax. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to introduce the witnesses from Alpha Fix Capital to our witnesses from the Chamber of Commerce, and I would like our witnesses from the Chamber of Commerce to meet our witnesses from Alpha Fix Capital. It seems that Alpha Fix Capital is a very successful green investment firm with billions of dollars in green bonds and green investment funds. It seems that the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has many good green investment opportunities. So I can't help but wondering, why are you guys spending your afternoon talking with a room full of politicians instead of talking with each other about all these investment opportunities that you could work together on, and instead of asking for more government regulations? And wouldn't it be better if politicians step back and let you guys do your thing, and we could have a greener, better economy as a result?
Some of the challenges that we are facing. As successful as we were in our green bonds, the transition has been a much tougher challenge. And we are trying to replicate the success factors in the green bond to the transition world. That's why we're here, just to say there's a piece missing, and that piece is the taxonomy for the transition. And yeah, I'm glad to come here and chat, but I do have other things to do. But at the same time, I think it's important there are some very low-hanging fruits, and that's one of them. So what's holding back the taxonomy? Not sure, but it's holding back investments. As long as companies do not know the rules of the game, do not know where the goalposts are, it's very difficult for them to allocate capital.
And from the Chamber of Commerce, like why does the government have to be the one providing the taxonomy? Why can't you guys communicate with each other?
Well, I'm pleased to say that we do regularly communicate with our members. In fact, Brian and I both have councils that do a great inanimate amount of work in this area. And what our members are really telling us is that greater certainty and clarity is required. That said, there are a number of innovative solutions that our members are trying to drive forward, and they're excited to do so, and they're looking to attract more capital to be able to let business be business and innovate and come up with those bleeding edge solutions that are going to drive our net zero ambitions.
Okay, let's come back to Mr. Keeley. Mr. Keeley, in your opening statement, you said, if I have one piece of advice for this committee, it is to avoid a great deal of economic and financial sacrifice for no apparent gain. Could you elaborate on what you meant by that?
Yeah, sure. I think that I think we got into a lot of it in the course of the discussion, which is divestiture. And all of these issues about greater disclosures, almost certainly just lead back to the divestiture question. People would end up divesting from those who are dirtier industries, and that's not going to solve things. So I would just, strongly say that if we're going to decarbonize our industries, if we're going to make the grid greener, if we're going to have an effective carbon tax, I would recommend a carbon border adjustment tax, which has been recommended by Paul Ryan. Those would be far more sensible approaches than to impose a net zero portfolio restriction on your pensioners. We need to ask the question, we're all concerned about the climate. It's a horrible situation. The world is outliving its resources. There's no question. But what can Canadian pensioners actually do about that?
Okay, thank you.
I thought that was the question.
Thank you.
And Canadian pensioners do not solve the crisis by divesting.
Yeah. And go to Ms. Taylor-Roy, please.
And Mr. Keeley, you've received a lot of questions today. I will not be asking you one, but I did want to thank you because several times you have emphasized that the most important thing we can do is to have consumers stop consuming fossil fuels. And that is exactly what the Price on Pollution program is designed to do. It's to incorporate the environmental costs of consuming fuels into the price signal so that people will, in fact, consume less. You know, I think about the example of Reddit. I think when they shorted GameStop, and it was really interesting. You know, the supply and demand in terms of people investing in certain stocks or disinvesting from certain stocks actually has a great impact on the economic performance of that company in the stock market, perhaps not fundamentally. And so this idea that somehow we cannot make any difference by directing the flow of capital to those companies which are in green pursuit seems to me to be misguided. And I was wondering to Jessica, I'm sorry I've forgotten your last name. I wrote down your first name. But to Jessica, if you could talk a little bit about the importance of having investment flows come into companies, that it's clear. You mentioned earlier that it has to be very clear to investors what the parameters are, but obviously that is so that they feel comfortable investing in these companies. So what is the importance to your membership of having investment in these green and transitional companies?
Thank you for the question. Well, I think we know from SFAC that there is a large gap in investment, and I think it's been clear that Canada is struggling with its productivity and its economic growth. So I would go back to that, and that we have a $115 billion a year investment gap that Canada has to fill in order to deliver on our net zero and transition commitments. And so really when we speak to our members, what they're asking for is additional partnership with government to promote investment in innovative technologies, and also the clarity that investors are seeking to invest in these kinds of technologies. Brian?
And if I may jump in very quickly, I just wanted to note that the large majority of businesses in Canada are small and medium-sized enterprise, and they also need a lot of support as they try to green their operations. So we were happy to see in recent months and in the last budget some of the money that was owed to small and medium-sized businesses through the carbon rebate program actually flow towards those businesses, because that's another key pillar of our advocacy and of many of our members that are much closer to their communities across Canada.